In terms of housekeeping, I would like to say, do not be afraid. The slides will be posted on our website, and you will have access to those shortly after the program is over. So thank you very much for your patience. And this is to keep things interesting, right? Because if you get the slides in advance, then you're like, oh, I know what they're going to be talking about. So we want to keep things interesting. I want to acknowledge that we've had some questions coming in through our viewers through the webcast. And Alina will be reading some of those questions shortly. What else would I like to say? Que de verdad quiero decir que es un placer estar con ustedes en esta mañana. It is truly a pleasure to be with you this morning. My name is Lourdes Rodriguez, and I serve as program officer at the New York State Health Foundation. And if Alina is ready, I would like to at least have the questions that were submitted online on record, even if we cannot go into discussion of them right now. Alina?
There were 3 questions that came from the web. The last one was from Ray Lewis, I think in Minnesota. How might we use these materials, referring to Natalie's training materials, to develop a local and national resolution to introduce at our upcoming precinct caucus? And then there were a couple of earlier questions for Gil, related to the protective effect of college education to counter the negative factors he talked about, and also about the failure of report cards and indicators to spur change, and what then, and how do we use our limited resources to demand or require change.
So our apologies for not being able to address those questions right now, but we promise to send those to the speakers. So you actually get an individualized, personalized response to your question if you send it online. So I would like to frame the rest of the conversation today. Sani this morning set the vision for this roundtable on population health as being to develop a strong, healthful, and productive society. And Phyllis said that our call to action today is to achieve that vision by tackling head-on racism. Gil added that we can get away from race and ethnicity as 2 important factors affecting health. And Natalie made us think about how equity lens is like the Matrix red pill. So at this moment, you have a decision whether you will take that red pill or the blue pill. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I am just aging myself, and I consider myself an elder, and I invite you to watch the movie, because it will help you understand the equity lens. And to continue the conversation, I would like to invite my friend and colleague, Dr. Mindy Fullilove, to join us. She is a professor of clinical psychiatry at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. She's also a great baker. Little known fact that she makes great pies. So Mindy, without further ado, take us ahead on the conversation.
Thank you, Lourdes. I'm the president of Pie Club. So one of our goals, my family has a tradition of having a fall fair in which there was a pie baking contest, and our Pie Club wanted to make a pie baking contest. And we, one year we were like, this is our year. And the pie came out, and it tasted the crust, and some of it was wrong, it was terrible. It was gorgeous, but it tasted terrible. So we had to throw it in the garbage.
Mindy, you need to use the microphone.
So we had baked this pie, and it was gorgeous looking, but it tasted terrible, so we had to throw it in the garbage. And we were in despair because this is the year we were going to win the blue ribbon at this fall fair. And Lourdes was there, and she's like, no, we're going to make another pie. And we won, so. No, but next time we have a meeting of Pie Club, you're all invited. So, thinking about the Flint, which obviously is on the minds of all of us, we have a brief timeline says they made a decision to change the water source. As data came in saying there was a problem, there was a refusal to acknowledge this. And the State Health Department said, no, we need more evidence. Meanwhile, there was ongoing exposure of people to toxins, and there was ongoing exposure of the pipes to corrosive agents. So the end result was that a $2 million savings might cost $1.5 billion. And so really what's on the minds of all of us is, because we know perfectly well this is not the only example of bad thinking, what's wrong with this thinking? So I'm co-author of a book on collective consciousness, and with Roderick Wallace have thought a lot about errors in collective thinking. And so there are three that I think are fundamental to this that relate to making bad policies. And bad policies, once made, have a very long life. So these three are social disintegration, white privilege thinking, and petty-mindedness. So I want to talk about that first, about the historical process of policy-promoted social disintegration. What's I think is fundamentally important is that in the sort of long civil rights era between the 40s and the 60s, a whole series of civil rights battles were won, voting rights, et cetera. But at the same time, policies were implemented which actually destroyed communities. And the net result of being able to vote but having your community destroyed is what we see today. So that's what we're really trying to understand and grapple with. Eva Marie Sims, who's at Duquesne University, a phenomenologist, wrote a brilliant paper about childhood in Pittsburgh's Hill District. And what she talked about, people had described to her in their childhoods in the 1930s to 1960, was that they lived in a dense social world, so that all of the adults were engaged in raising all of the children. And as Granovetter talks about strong ties and weak ties, we tried to illustrate this with the right angles being the strong ties and the sweeps being the weak ties, that there were all kinds of strong and weak ties in that community. And one of the books that I really take as kind of a foundation for my thinking is the Sterling County series, of which Alexander Layton was the lead scientist. But this book, People of Cove and Woodlock, which the lead researcher was John Hughes, really sets out this concept of social disintegration and social integration. And this is a photograph which is supposed to illustrate that in this kind of, more ideal community, this is what it looked like. And this photograph, which is by Esther Bubley, of an art class at the Irene Kaufman Settlement House in the Hill District, is full of the exact same kind of peace and connection. So Pittsburgh's Hill District is it's one of the black segregated areas. The red triangle is the part of the neighborhood that was designated for urban renewal. So this is what the streets look like, and it was a tight grid of little streets. People lived very closely packed together. It was a dense mixed-use neighborhood, so there was industry, there was residence, and there was commercial. This is one view of it, and you can see that the streets go directly down and are directly connected to downtown Pittsburgh, so that this community flows into the heart of the city. This is another view of the street, Wiley Avenue. There's a PBS show called Wiley Avenue Days, which is about this historic moment in the history of this community. So it was a dense, lively, vibrant place. Crawford Grill was one of many jazz clubs. This was a place that really rocked. This photograph is by Charles Teeny Harris, who left a massive archive, which is now at the Carnegie Museum of Art. And so his 80,000 photos capture the complexity of the life of this community, what was going on. Of course, it's also represented in the plays of August Wilson. And what is important in the evidence, the photographic evidence, is life, is sort of reciprocity, mutuality, people helping each other, people engaged with each other, and people creating. So I like to say to my students, what are all the different kinds of organizations that it takes to get a marching band on the road? And it's really a lot once you start to add it up. Richard Saunders was actually my next door neighbor and was in Pittsburgh as part of the Pittsburgh Photographic Project. and did a wonderful series of photos. This photo by Teenie Harris, I think is Rembrandtian in the sense of really trying to capture the majesty of civic life. In fact, there was recently an exhibition here in Washington on Dutch paintings of civic life. It's that same kind of feeling of occupying the street peacefully to just enjoy a Saturday afternoon. I was not myself a checkers player, but I mean, not a good checkers player, but that guy has a deadly move. I'm thinking this guy is not going to have luck. Stanley Crouch said of the Teenie Harris archive that this collection provides us with an epic sense of life, which is to say that a civilization and how it worked is laid out before us. And this is immensely important because in the rhetoric of urban renewal, this neighborhood was called a blighted slum that was a cancer on the city. And the only way to save the city was to destroy it, to literally wipe it off the face of the earth. And so to have this evidence, this photographic evidence of this epic sense of life, helps to create a sense of how wrong the policy was. So how do you make a decision like that? So this is really where white privilege thinking is illustrated. It happens that in Pittsburgh they take pictures of everything. It's quite an extraordinary city. It's extraordinarily beautiful. Anybody here from Pittsburgh? There has to be people here from Pittsburgh. No? Extraordinarily beautiful, but also it goes up and down in complex ways, and it has those three rivers. So you're always stunned by its beauty, just always. So they like to take pictures of it. Urban renewal, which was authorized by the Housing Act of 1949 and implemented in that 14-year period, carried out 2,500 projects in 1,000 American cities. But what's important is that 63% of the people who were relocated were African American. So people in the black community talked about urban renewal is Negro removal, but this is the profound truth of that. So just by a simple ratio, that would suggest that 1,600 projects were directed at African American neighborhoods. These are the men who made the plan. I think it's great that Pittsburgh took pictures of. I mean, really, if I stood up here as a black woman and said white men made the decision, it gets discounted. Like, yeah, you think that. But if I show you the picture, white men made the decision. There's no women, there's no black people, that's who made the decision. The Franciscan Richard Rohr talked about white privilege in a way that I thought really makes it accessible to me. And he said that the sort of we set the tone mood that we white folks live inside of and take totally for granted and even naturally deserved. So that this, getting a group of any group of people together and say, well, make a decision. That they can make a decision without referring to outsiders and feel perfectly justified because they all went along with it. And so this idea of white privilege thinking, I think, is of profound importance, and I really appreciate it, Natalie, bringing that to our attention as well. I think talking about privilege and how it influences thinking in policymaking is of profound importance as we try to understand Flint. One of the ideas for the urban renewal area was to create a civic arena, and it had a retractable roof. And it had a retractable roof because Edgar Kaufman, the department store magnate and owner of Fallingwater, Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpiece, liked to listen to light opera, and he liked to listen to light opera out of doors. So he was going to have light opera in the civic arena, and the roof would retract, and therefore he would be out of doors. And this is the civic light opera crowd. And there are black people. There's a black guy. So the point is that the white power structure was able to label, and did label, this epic civilization that existed in the Hill District as a blighted slum that was a cancer on the city, and they wiped it out. This is the original plan. This is what it looks like afterwards. And you can see that not only did they wipe out this whole section of the hill, but they put highways between the remaining African American community and downtown Pittsburgh, and parking lots. And as I'm a psychiatrist, I must also point out that this spaceship is a very ambivalent artifact. Jung says that spaceships are like an idea of reconciliation, and I think it's possible that the architect thought making a spaceship there would be reconciliation. But we all know how the other thing about spaceships, which was that they're aliens and they take you and they do experiments on you, right? And that's what motivated John Belushi to heroism in 4th of July, right? That the aliens had taken him and he was going to get them back. He's like, see, I told you they were aliens, and I'm going to get them. Nobody knows that movie either? Oh, thank you. You should never make cultural references, right? This is another photo by Richard Saunders, and it's this photo that I think is definitional of what I've come to call root shock, which I defined as the traumatic stress reaction to losing all or part of one's emotional ecosystem. So in wiping out a huge neighborhood, people have root shock, just as plants would have if we yanked them out of the ground. So these are profound experiences, and the people who do these things are saying, well, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. But the people who are living it are losing their neighborhood, they're losing their neighbors, they're losing their businesses, they're losing their churches, they're losing schools. They're having their whole life upended. They have to make a new life. And so all of those are costs. Huge emotional costs, economic costs, social costs, political costs. Jazz almost dies as a music in this period. And people have blamed air conditioning and television. But I think that the real definition is, the real problem is really urban renewal. In all of the urban renewal neighborhoods that I've had the opportunity to visit, there were jazz clubs that were unable to locate to new places. And so a massive number of jazz clubs were destroyed in this process. And they were central to the itinerant life of jazz musicians. So this is my definition of root shock. So Eva Marie Sims noted that in the period after urban renewal, in 1960 to 1980, the people she interviewed talk about there being no clear path, and that the networks have become, they're still dense, but they're not as dense as they were. So one of her respondents said, yeah, some of the neighbors could tell me what to do, but not all of them, because we didn't know all of them. Whereas before, all the adults could discipline all the children. That's no longer the case. It started to break apart. And in that breaking apart, not only are people heartsick for their lost neighborhood, but if you don't have all the adults monitoring all the children start to misbehave. And other things start to fall apart as well. Carlos Peterson is an artist in the Hill District, and he then did a great deal of art looking at the disinvestment, the just kind of sagging in of buildings that didn't have adequate resources to be maintained. This is actually from Detroit, but all of industry in Pittsburgh was eliminated effectively as well in a very short period of time. So in a factory or a huge steel mill, you'd have thousands of people working together. One of the things that happened in the aftermath of deindustrialization was that white workers were able to get education and to segue into scientific and technical fields. So Pittsburgh has rebuilt its economy on the so-called eds and meds, education and medicine. But African Americans were not able to get into to get that education and to get into those fields, and have basically been left behind, not only in the economy of Pittsburgh, but in economies all across the United States. So I'd like to segue from white privilege to petty-mindedness. This is something that economist Paul Krugman has written about a great deal. But I think the concept is very useful for us to think about. He is basically saying that we don't want to spend money for things that we ought to spend money for. So this disinvestment, this is the Middle Hill in Pittsburgh, so led to the collapse of buildings, vast abandonment, and the falling apart as investment of every single kind was borne out. This is part of the long ravages of redlining. These are neighborhoods that were, if not legally redlined, they were paradigmatically redlined. And I happened to be working in Bayview Hunters Point, San Francisco, when the last institution of note, which was a Wells Fargo branch, was taken out. The grocery stores were taken out. Everything was taken out. If you needed a sandwich for lunch, you had to go a good distance outside of the neighborhood to get it. But this is perhaps one of the saddest pictures by Helen Stummers. This little boy is Herminio, and in the bags are clothes that he's carrying home to his mother, and that's where they live, in a cardboard shack. This is Newark, New Jersey, 5 blocks from downtown. This took out our cities, took out the core of our cities all across the United States. And why? Because we didn't want to spend the money, and we particularly didn't want to spend money for those people. It's sort of that not only did they create slum neighborhoods that were a cancer, but we tried to cure the cancer, and then they just brought it back. And they made all the buildings burn down, and they don't take care of themselves, and why should we? And this becomes a particular and seemingly justifiable representation of a much deeper problem, which is that we actually aren't, at this moment, taking care of our collective assets. Terrifyingly, 20%, according to the EPA, of American water systems have toxins in them. 61% of the bridges are in need of repair, which is really terrifying. And our electrical grid breaks down more frequently than the electrical grid in any other developing nation. We are not taking care of our shared assets. And if we think of our cities as not simply a problem of those people and why won't they go away, but as a shared asset, we can see it's part of this same petty-minded thinking. In social disintegration, Alexander Layton proposed that there were these characteristics. So a high frequency of broken homes. There was a comment earlier about what happens to families. Few and weak associations, few and weak leaders, few patterns of recreation, a high frequency of hostility, a high frequency of crime and delinquency, and weak and fragmented networks of communication. But what is often poorly understood is that not only are these things happening in the so-called targeted neighborhoods, but that if you destroy some neighborhoods in a city in this manner, you actually undermine the functioning of the whole city. And you throw the whole city into a phase of social disintegration, so that all of these things become part of what's characteristic of the larger place. And that's where we really see that in the context of weak and fragmented networks of communication, that white privilege thinking and petty-mindedness, so in the context of social disintegration, these really have won the day. We're not having rational conversations about choices. Think only about the national conversation about global warming, which doesn't exist. And so Eva Marie Sims pointed out that one of her interviewees said of the Hill District that in this period, so 1980 to 2004, that you didn't know what to expect. So it was no longer a comprehensible neighborhood. It was, you go out your door, you look to the left, you look to the right, and you hope nobody's shooting. So it became a very scary and dangerous place. The social bonds, both strong ties, so the families are fragmenting, churches are fragmenting, but also the weak ties, the ties that carry across groups, are disappearing. And so the fragmentation on both levels is becoming universal. As Paul Krugman said, these aren't really separate stories. What we see in Flint is an all too typically American situation of literally poisonous interaction between ideology and race, in which small government extremists are empowered by the sense of too many voters, that good government is simply a giveaway to those people. So in the work that I've been involved with for 30 years, and Lourdes worked with me for quite a few of those. She's very young, so not that many. Anyway, we documented the AIDS epidemic, the crack epidemic, the violence epidemic, the mental illness related to violence epidemic, the multi-drug resistant tuberculosis epidemic in a 10-year period. And then the whole team said, we got to stop. There must be something we can do. What can we do? And that started basically a 20-year journey towards what do we think? Where's the pivot in all of this? From our perspective, we think that American science is focused all too little on context, and that these issues of history, urban renewal, and all of these other policies, there's a long series of policies that I haven't gone into, that they are creating the context in which all of these behaviors arise. And that policies like urban renewal, which fell unequally on populations, and which are followed by many other policies which do the same thing, have horrific effects on minority populations, but also on the whole population. That we have to understand the way in which this context is playing out if we are actually going to create population health. We think at the heart of this, because this is about context, is that we need to add a sense of this larger context. We need tools for studying context, and we have personally, I have, and my colleagues have, adopted a perspective of urbanism, which we see as the science of the ecology of cities. From visiting many people's projects, especially Michel Cantal-Dupart, who's a French urbanist, his projects in France, but also 2 decades of visiting in the Hill District, I have abstracted 9 principles of urban restoration, 9 elements of urban restoration. And I just want to talk about the first one, city in mind, because this is, like Natalie's idea of shifting to equity, this is a shift in cognition, cognitive shift. I think about it from the perspective of psychiatry, where we have found that cognitive therapies are phenomenally effective, that if you can convince a person who's depressed to give up their all or nothing thinking, their depression will lift. And from that, we have been able to translate this to treatments for many, many, many illnesses. And so I think that one of the treatments for the ways in which division and apartness and otherness are lodged in our minds is to begin to see the big picture, the whole picture. And so this first principle of urban restoration is that we can't just focus on neighborhoods or populations, but we must think more holistically, and we must have the whole city in mind. Michel Cantal-Dupart, who's an architect urbanist, has done a lot of work in a city called Perpignan, which is nestled between the Pyrenees and the Mediterranean, part of French Catalonia. And one of the things that was going on in that city was that there were 3 housing projects that, this is literally, what is marginalization? So the housing projects were built at the margins, but not only that, but when they were built, they were effectively cut off from easy connection to the rest of the city and to downtown. So in this housing project, to get there, you had to go under a very, very narrow bridge. It was the only way in. There was a road that went right by the housing project, but there was a fence. So you literally couldn't get to the road, which was 100 feet away. This is the fence. This is the housing project. See, that's the road. You literally can't get there because there was a fence. He said, let us just make a few adjustments. Let's take out a small piece of this building and a small piece of that building and connect the road. And in that way, end marginalization, end the geography of separation, and start to bring people together because they can easily get to each other. They can go back and forth. The neighborhood is welcoming. It's not a scary enclave with those people in it. It's a part of the city. We have thought of this as Sims 4, restoration, in which people start to find common ground, and as they are talking to each other in real new conversations, that they find that things are starting to make sense. We see that as the first step towards healing and towards recovery. And I would just like to end by quoting Ben Franklin. We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately. Thank you.
Thank you, and I would like to invite you. We're going to pull up an opera on you. If you have no idea what I'm referencing, Google it. All right. So I would like to start by saying thank you. Because yesterday when we were preparing this presentation, Mindy was going to stop at the slide that talked about those people. The pivot point was not in her presentation. And I said, you can't leave us there. Like that, my heart, it aches when that's the point where we stop our conversation, right? And this idea that there is something that we can do about is very important. That's why we're here today. So before I take to the floor for questions, if you will allow me, I want to pose one question, which is this idea of those people, the othering of anyone who is not like me. How do we start to undo or bridge that othering?
I think actually that it starts as soon as we say, like when we're working with community groups in cities, it starts as soon as we say, let's go see the whole city. And there was a group in Durham which did a citywide reading of my book, Urban Alchemy. And I said, you got to go see the city. There's not a book you can just sit in your armchair and read. You got to go see. And I specifically said, go see the American Tobacco Trail, but go anywhere. And one group went to the west side, and they asked people, well, what do you love about your neighborhood? And then they were like, wait, now we want to know what people love about all over the city. And that's a whole different way to see the city than in sort of white neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, downtown, what I'm scared of, what is like me. So I think that actually we have to physically go and see the city all together. And we have to understand how it's organized, how it's spatially organized. We have to understand its history. And then that starts the conversation in which we say, but wait, there's some things that we have in common. Wait, I didn't know that about your neighborhood. I have the same problem in my neighborhood. Inevitably comes up. And I think that's how we start. We have to move out of our groove, go someplace else.
Thank you. Sir?
My name is Alan Herman. I came to this country about 30 plus years ago. And what struck me when I first arrived was that the normative narrative of America is white racism, or actually male white racism. And as an offset of that, one of the great quotes that I use a lot is from Alan Locke, who was the founder of the Harlem Renaissance. And he said, I don't know why a people that are so important to the editorial content of American life are so disregarded. Because all that is America for those living outside, most of it is black people's lives. And I found that in the absence of a coherent public frame, public policy is white, male, and racist. And so when you are confronting a large problem like AIDS in Africa, you have to reframe that by talking about our common humanity, that we are bound by this common humanity. And Ron Dellums and I used that to create the funding for AIDS internationally. And the idea, I think, for policy framing is to create a different narrative. That's why I think the cycle of plays on Pittsburgh is so very important, that black folk in Pittsburgh are Southerners. They come from Mississippi. In the piano lesson, August Wilson's piano lesson, he talks about the yellow boxcars from Mississippi, from Yahoo, Mississippi. And I've worked in Yahoo, Mississippi. And the fascinating part of it is that Pittsburghians have a Southern heritage and a Southern narrative about family and about value that Wilson picks up in his cycle of 10 plays. So I wanted for you to sort of maybe talk a little bit about framing and narratives as we create policies for urban settings and for folk that have been disregarded, as Alain Locke once said.
I completely agree with you that there's a huge amount that we have to do about framing. But I'd like to take it from this moment of embodiment, that we have embodied habits of being in space with each other. And all of these policies, the arc of policies in the second half of the 20th century was, and here I cite Thomas Hanchett, to sort us by race and class. And therefore, we have gotten into grooves of being separate from each other. We might see each other at work, but we're not really friends outside of work. And I go home to my black neighborhood, somebody else goes home to their whatever neighborhood. We don't live together. and we don't know each other. And therefore, going someplace else and seeing someplace else, in my experience, that this moving your body through space differently is fundamentally important to then, wait, I saw something different, I have something different to say. And it starts the excitement. My hometown is Orange, New Jersey, and it's majority black, poor city, so it's demonized as a bad place. But one of the things that we noticed was that, oddly enough, it's very small, 2.2 square miles, but everything you want to know about the American city you can learn in Orange, New Jersey, which has become a slogan. But it's quite remarkable. We have a library that was designed by Stanford White, the great architect. The park in Orange was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. So, we had the Radium Girls are from Orange, New Jersey. Terrible workplace, occupational exposure to radiation. There's a highway through the middle of the town. There's a historic ghetto. There's Italian immigrants. There's Irish immigrants. There's immigrants, and now there's immigrants from all over the world. So, but we had to walk around, and we had to really see the city, and we had to think, wait, Frederick Law Olmsted, he's famous, wait. Mount Auburn Cemetery, the pastoral cemetery, we have a pastoral cemetery. We have everything, good, bad, and the ugly. So, but we had to walk around and see it and take it in, and that's how we've been creating a new narrative. I think it's a process.
Thank you. I think Amy has some questions from our webcast folks.
I do. So first of all, there's a number of people from Pittsburgh listening who appreciate it.
Hi, Pittsburgh.
And really were thankful for that, and said that they're from those neighborhoods and understand and relate to the history of what you were presenting. We also had a comment that said the urban renewal that took place in the lower uprooted the diverse culture in that community and fractured the cultural identity of the Hill District, as well as literally drew a line between that community and the city. There is a profound sense of displacement. And then we also have a question from Lourdes J, and there was a similar question for another speaker earlier for Ray Lewis, and I think it's probably something that is relevant to all the speakers. In the coverage of the 2016 presidential race, I have not heard the discourse on health equity, reducing racial and ethnic health disparities, or addressing the social determinants of health inequity. How might we get these issues on the national political agendas?
I think that's above my pay grade.
We have heard it, but the wrong framing.
Yeah,
I'm
as
just
I
gonna
said, I
leave
think
it
it's
at
something
that.
for the people to think about throughout the day.
Let's let everybody in the room. There must be some Washingtonians here who know the answer to that. You got an easier question?
Another question did just come in. How do the current trends of gentrification support as well as undermine health equity?
Well, I can handle that one. Thank you, Internet. Gentrification, there was a debate about gentrification and what was it doing. But that debate is, I think, effectively over. And it's just...
Who won?
No, I mean, the debate was gentrification going to displace the poor? And for a long time, people were like, no, this is great. We're just bringing in people with more money, and it's going to be fine. It's going to equalize it. It's going to be a mixed income community, and that's what's going to happen. And that's obviously not what's happening. That as richer people come in, for example, in New York City, there are all kinds of pressures that get asserted, and the poor get swept out. There's social housing in neighborhoods like Harlem, so some number of people are stable, but on the other hand, the store where they shop, the laundromat where they did their clothes, those get washed away. So it becomes more difficult to live in these places. And the developers look at the housing projects, which are underfunded, and they say, well, we could help, give us some of your land. So it's endless. So I think the debate over was gentrification going to sweep away the poor has been effectively ended. And I think that's captured in Mayor de Blasio's policy to build 200,000 units of affordable housing. The problem is that it's very difficult to build affordable housing because there are no national policies to house what people call the lower end of the demographic. So it's either market rate housing or nothing. And if they can shoehorn a few affordable units into the market rate development, that's about what we're going to get for poor people. So the bottom line is that all of these policies that I talked about, the urban renewal and the disinvestment, destroyed low-income housing without replacement. And now that we've eliminated the programs that could create new low-income housing, we're creating homelessness. Like, some people are doomed to homelessness. There's not enough housing units. So I think it's a terrifically serious problem, and but we need a much bigger perspective than just let's give the developers some tax breaks to put in some affordable housing units. We actually have to acknowledge that everybody has a right to housing, and that we have to build housing for the whole demographic.
I think that goes a little bit to your point of petty-mindedness, right?
Yes,
so the
it
idea
does.
that we need to invest on the things that are going to have the biggest yield.
Because why would you want to house those people? You would want them to go away. And really I can't go to meetings of white people where however they talk about race gets talked about as freely as possible. I don't get to go to those meetings. But certainly among black middle class people, there's a lot of classism. And they will come right out and say, we have enough of those people. We could have fewer. So the petty-mindedness, the thinking that you don't have to have those people in your city, they can go someplace else and this has no consequences. You know, part of the idea of how racism makes us insane is the idea that you can push people away and then you've eliminated the problem. And that's it's completely irrational. And that's why having this sense of urbanism, of the ecology of cities, and then ecology in general, right? That we are all interconnected. You can't push people someplace else and have no consequences on yourself. It doesn't work like that. So how do we get this scientific understanding across all of America? That's why I've just become so passionate, and I was just so honored when Spirit House decided to have a citywide book reading of my book, just to open up this conversation. Let's think about cities in a scientific way. And of course the payoff is that these kinds of interventions that you can make in cities from this perspective of the whole city are very, very, very powerful. So not only is it scientifically correct, it's socially powerful.
Okay, thank you.
So I think it's a question and maybe just a comment. So we talked about, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, which is 3 hours from Pittsburgh. I watched the same thing happen in Columbus with urban renewal and the gentrification. So the next step is I look at cities like DC, Philadelphia, Camden, Baltimore, where public housing is located in places that are gentrifying. I think about Martin Luther King Boulevard when I used to work in the city of Maryland, Baltimore rather, going to the State Building, and I'm looking at public housing, and I'm looking at all the gentrification that's going on right across the street at the University of Maryland. What's the next step that we can prevent? Because in my mind, I see public housing that exists in places in cities disappearing for the sake of gentrification or whatever you want to call it. So how do we work now around policies to prevent that from either happening or have some kind of intelligent conversation that doesn't repeat the past again and again and again?
Well, what I've learned from my travels and my studies of cities, which I tried to capture in these elements of urban restoration, is that there's a process that, for the most part, because American policy and American science are focused on the individual, and we don't understand context, and we don't include it in our work, that really the first step is getting the context. So the first step is walk around Baltimore and to start to learn the stories of the whole city, and to start to see what Cantal calls the elephants, the wonderful things, especially the wonderful things in unexpected places, and to start to share those with each other. Because part of the issue with public housing is it's got to be seen as part of what we need in a whole city. And it is where it is, and then what does the public housing need to be supported? One of the things public housing needs is maintenance, and it's not getting maintenance anywhere in the nation. And then they blame the people in the public housing for their bad management and say, well, you people wrecked it, you're a distressed community, let's tear it down. But we have to put this in context of the bridges we aren't maintaining, the electrical grid we aren't maintaining, the streets we aren't plowing when there's snow, so that people get the big picture and they can see where the social disintegration has torn us apart, where white privilege thinking has given us bad ideas, and where petty-mindedness is a dead end. But we get that by seeing the whole. So
I think we have to walk our cities together. I just think we've walked many cities together. And let me just tell you a story about Lourdes. There's a park near our offices that is so beautiful, but it had literally, in a period of like budget cutbacks, they put a fence through the middle of the park and they would mow the lawn on one side and completely neglect the other side. And it was a crazy time in the history of the neighborhood. So murders were going on in the park, robberies, all kinds of crime. And it became a very fearsome place. And when we wanted to encourage investment in the park, what Lourdes said was, look, we've got to do an exorcism of this park. And we've got to do that by having walking meetings. We've got to take people into the park. We can't just go to their office and say, there's a nice park over there. We've got to say, let's have a meeting and let's go to the park. I have hundreds of pictures of Lourdes with different groups walking in the park. And today, that park has really been reclaimed. And there's been investment. There's been, $90 million of investment in that park, making it on the way to being a real asset to the community again. But what's most important is that the people go there. And walking in the park, taking school teachers, taking community leaders, taking healthcare providers into the park, and so that they could see the beauty and they could say, yeah, this is worth restoring. That was an essential part of the work.
And we posed the question, how are you going to contribute to the improvement of this space? And we want to leave you with that question. How are you going to contribute to the improvement of population health by thinking critically about how policies are going to affect everybody or improve the life of everybody? And I want you to join me in thanking Mindy for leading us today in this conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I would like to invite Tom